The first frost came early that year, settling over the hills like a warning. Margaret Delaney stood at her kitchen window, watching the mist rise from the fields as dawn broke over the farm. She had lived in this house for 40 years, raised chickens and vegetables, buried a husband, and learned the particular silence that comes with growing old alone. The house creaked in familiar places. The wind knew which doors to rattle. Everything had its rhythm, its pattern, its place. She poured her coffee and carried it to the porch, wrapping her shawl tighter against the October chill. The farm stretched before her, 70 acres of memory and labor, fields now fallow, the barn leaning slightly to the left like an old man favoring a bad hip. Thomas had always meant to fix that barn, but Thomas had been dead 3 years now, buried in the cemetery on the hill beside his parents and his younger brother. Margaret sipped her coffee and watched the road. No cars, no visitors, just the way she liked it. But then, just past 8 in the morning, she saw the dust rising from the gravel road that led to her property. A car, a black car, moving slowly, deliberately, like a priest approaching a deathbed. Margaret set down her coffee cup. In 40 years, very few cars had come down that road uninvited. The mailman, the propane delivery, once a lost tourist. But this car was not lost. This car knew exactly where it was going. The Cadillac pulled into her driveway and stopped. 3 men stepped out. All of them wore dark suits, despite the rural setting, despite the mud and dust. The driver was young, maybe 30, with slicked hair and cold eyes. The second man was older, heavier, with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone and left out in the rain. The third man stayed near the car, watching the road, his hand resting inside his jacket. The older man approached the porch. He did not smile, but his voice was polite, almost gentle. "Ma'am," he said, "we are sorry to disturb you this morning. My name is Angelo Benedetti. We are looking for someone who used to live here, Thomas Delaney. We believe you knew him." Margaret did not move from her chair. "I am his widow," she said. "Thomas died 3 years ago, heart attack. He is buried at St. Mary's." Angelo nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am, but we have reason to believe that before he passed, your husband may have kept something that belongs to our employer. A map, a document, something of great importance." Margaret shook her head. "My husband was a farmer," she said. "He did not keep maps, just seed catalogues and tax papers." The younger man stepped forward, his impatience visible. Angelo raised a hand, stopping him. The gesture was small, but absolute. The young man retreated. Angelo continued, "Ma'am, we do not wish to trouble you, but our employer is a man who values completeness. He believes your husband may have taken something when he left his previous employment. We would very much like to recover it, for sentimental reasons, you understand." Margaret met his gaze. There was nothing in his eyes but patience and certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from never being told no. "I do not know what you are talking about," she said. "My husband worked this farm his whole life. He never worked for anyone else." Angelo studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Of course, ma'am. Perhaps we are mistaken, but if you do happen to find anything unusual, any documents or papers you do not recognize, we would appreciate a call." He produced a card from his pocket and placed it on the porch railing. The card was plain white, with only a phone number printed in black ink. No name, no address. "We will not trouble you further," Angelo said, "but we may return just to make certain. You understand?" It was not a question. The 3 men returned to the Cadillac. The engine purred to life, and the car rolled back down the gravel road, slow and deliberate, leaving only dust and silence in its wake. Margaret sat very still. Her coffee had gone cold. Her hands, which had not trembled in years, were shaking now. She rose from her chair and went inside. She locked the door. She pulled the curtains closed. Then she walked through the house, through the kitchen and the hallway, to the narrow door that led to the basement. She had not opened this door in months. There was nothing in the basement but old furniture, canning jars, and a lifetime of things too useless to keep and too heavy to throw away. But in the far corner, beneath a sheet covered in dust, was a metal chest. It was not large. It was not ornate. It was the kind of chest a man might use to store tools or fishing gear. Thomas had kept it locked, always. And when he died, Margaret had placed it in the basement and covered it and tried to forget it existed. She pulled the sheet aside. The lock was still intact. She did not have the key. Thomas had kept the key on a chain around his neck, and it had been buried with him. Margaret stared at the chest for a long time. Then she climbed the stairs, returned to the kitchen, and retrieved a hammer and a chisel from the drawer beneath the sink. She had lived 40 years in silence, asking no questions, trusting her husband, believing the life they built was real. But now men in black suits were asking about maps, and her husband's grave felt very far away. She returned to the basement. She knelt beside the chest, and she broke the lock. Inside there were papers, documents, photographs, and folded carefully at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a map. It was hand-drawn, old, the ink faded in places. It showed streets and buildings, warehouses and docks. There were names written in the margins. Some had been crossed out, others were circled. And at the top of the map, in Thomas's careful handwriting, were 3 words: Vincent Caruso, informant, federal. Margaret sat back on her heels. Her breath came shallow. Vincent Caruso. She knew that name. Everyone along the coast knew that name. He was the Don of the Caruso family, the man who controlled the ports, the shipping lanes, the unions. He was untouchable, invisible, a ghost in an expensive suit. And according to this map, he was a traitor. Margaret refolded the map and placed it back in the chest. She sat in the basement for a long time, listening to the house creak above her. The men would return. Angelo had promised as much, and when they did, they would not ask politely. They would search. They would demand. They would tear this house apart, board by board, until they found what they were looking for, unless she gave it to them first, unless she destroyed it, unless she used it. Margaret climbed the stairs. She locked the basement door. She made herself a fresh cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. Outside, the sun was climbing higher. The frost was melting. The fields were waking up. And Margaret Delaney, who had lived quietly for so long, began to plan. Because the men in black suits had made a mistake. They assumed she was just a widow, just an old woman on a farm. They assumed she knew nothing, understood nothing, mattered nothing. But Margaret had been married to Thomas Delaney for 37 years. She had watched him lie to neighbors, to friends, to the taxman. She had learned to recognize the signs, the late-night phone calls, the locked chest, the silences that lasted weeks. She had never asked questions because asking questions was dangerous, but not asking did not mean not knowing. Thomas had worked for Vincent Caruso. Thomas had kept secrets. And when Thomas died, those secrets did not die with him. They were buried, waiting. And now they had been dug up. Margaret rose from the table and walked to the window. The road was empty, but she knew the black Cadillac would return. Tomorrow, perhaps, or the next day. Men like Angelo Benedetti did not make idle threats. They made promises. She touched the card on the counter. The phone number stared back at her like a dare. Margaret Delaney had spent her entire life being underestimated by her father, who thought women belonged in kitchens, by her neighbors, who thought her simple, by her husband, who thought she understood nothing. But she had always understood. She had always watched. She had always waited. And now, finally, it was her turn to act. She picked up the card. She held it to the light. Then she placed it in her apron pocket next to the key to the basement door. The frost was gone. The day was warming. And Margaret Delaney, the quiet widow on the hill, began sharpening her knives. The black Cadillac returned 3 days later, just as Margaret knew it would. This time it arrived in the evening, when the shadows were long and the air carried the smell of wood smoke from distant chimneys. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing supper when she heard the gravel crunch beneath the tires. She did not go to the window. She did not need to. She knew who it was. She turned off the stove and wiped her hands on her apron. Then she walked to the door and waited. The knock came soft and measured, 3 taps like a heartbeat. She opened the door. Angelo Benedetti stood on her porch, the same stone face, the same patient eyes. Behind him, the younger man leaned against the Cadillac, smoking a cigarette. The third man was absent this time. Perhaps he was watching the road. Perhaps he was watching the house from somewhere Margaret could not see. "Good evening, ma'am," Angelo said. "I hope we are not disturbing your supper." Margaret stepped aside. "You might as well come in," she said. Angelo hesitated, surprised. Then he nodded and entered. The younger man flicked his cigarette into the dirt and followed. They stood in her small living room, their dark suits out of place among the faded floral wallpaper and the crocheted doilies on the furniture. Angelo removed his hat. The younger man did not. "Please sit," Margaret said. She gestured to the sofa. Angelo sat. The younger man remained standing, his eyes scanning the room, cataloguing every detail. Margaret sat in the armchair across from them. She folded her hands in her lap. "I have been thinking about your last visit," she said, "about what you said, about my husband." Angelo leaned forward slightly, his full attention on her now. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret met his gaze. "My husband did not speak much about his past. When I met him, he told me he had been in business before, but that he wanted a quieter life, a simpler life. I did not ask questions. A good wife does not question her husband." Angelo nodded. "Of course, but after you left," Margaret continued, "I began looking through his things. Old papers, documents, things I had not touched since he passed, and I found something." The younger man stepped closer. Angelo raised a hand again, and the young man stopped. "What did you find, ma'am?" Margaret looked down at her hands. "A box. A locked box. I had to break the lock. Inside were papers, photographs, and a map." The room went very still. Even the younger man stopped moving. Angelo's voice remained calm, but Margaret could hear the tension beneath it. "Where is this map now, ma'am?" Margaret lifted her eyes. "It is in the basement. I did not know what to do with it. I thought perhaps you could tell me." Angelo rose slowly from the sofa. The younger man was already moving toward the hallway. "Ma'am," Angelo said, "would you show us?" Margaret stood. "Of course. Follow me." She led them through the kitchen to the basement door. She unlocked it and descended the narrow stairs, her hand trailing along the wooden railing. The 2 men followed, their footsteps heavy on the old wood. The basement smelled of earth and mildew and the faint sweetness of rotting apples. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting weak yellow light. Margaret walked to the corner where the metal chest sat. The broken lock lay beside it. She gestured to the chest. "It is in there." Angelo knelt beside the chest. He opened it carefully, reverently, as if it contained something holy. He lifted out the oilcloth bundle and unwrapped it. The map lay in his hands, fragile and ancient. He studied it for a long moment, his eyes moving over the names, the streets, the notations. Then his face changed, just slightly, a tightening around the mouth, a narrowing of the eyes. He looked up at Margaret. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "have you read this map?" Margaret shook her head. "I do not understand maps. My husband was the one who understood such things." Angelo studied her face, searching for deception. Margaret kept her expression calm, blank, the face of a woman who had spent decades not asking questions. Finally, Angelo nodded. He refolded the map and placed it back in the oilcloth. He stood. "Ma'am, you have done the right thing by showing us this. Our employer will be grateful. Margaret clasped her hands together. "I only want peace," she said. "I only want to be left alone." Angelo placed a hand on her shoulder. It was meant to be comforting, but Margaret could feel the weight in it, the promise. "You will be left alone, ma'am. You have my word." The younger man was already climbing the stairs, the map tucked under his arm. Angelo followed. Margaret came last, turning off the basement light and locking the door behind her. The two men walked through her house and out the front door without another word. The Cadillac started. The headlights swept across the porch, and then they were gone, swallowed by the darkness and the trees. Margaret stood in the doorway until the sound of the engine faded completely. Then she closed the door and locked it. She walked back to the kitchen and turned the stove back on. She finished preparing her supper. She ate slowly, chewing each bite carefully, tasting nothing. When she was done, she washed her plate and her fork and her cup. She dried them and put them away. Then she walked to the bedroom and opened the top drawer of her dresser. Beneath her nightgowns and her socks, wrapped in a piece of flannel, was another map, the real map. Margaret unfolded it and spread it on the bed. It was identical to the one she had given Angelo, down to the last detail, the same streets, the same buildings, the same names in the margins. But there was one difference. One name that had been on the original map was missing from the copy she had given them. Vincent Caruso, informant, federal. Margaret had removed it. She had redrawn the map by hand, painstakingly copying every line, every notation, every name. It had taken her 2 full days, and most of 3 nights. Her hands had cramped, her eyes had burned, but she had done it. Because she knew that if Angelo saw Vincent Caruso's name on that map, if he saw the words informant and federal, Margaret would not have lived through the night. Men like Angelo did not tolerate loose ends, and a widow who knew the Don was a traitor was the loosest end of all. But now Angelo believed he had the map. He would take it to Vincent Caruso, and the Don would see the names of his enemies, the locations of his secrets, the careful notations his Consigliere had kept. He would be satisfied. He would believe the matter closed, and Margaret would be forgotten, just another old woman, just another widow, exactly as she wanted. She refolded the real map and placed it back in the drawer, beneath the flannel, beneath the nightgowns. Then she turned off the lights and went to bed. But she did not sleep. She lay awake in the darkness, listening to the house settle, listening to the wind in the trees, listening for the sound of car engines on the gravel road, because she knew this was not over. Not yet. Vincent Caruso would get his map. He would study it. He would see the names of men who had betrayed him, men who had whispered to the police, men who had sold his secrets, and he would deal with them one by one, as Dons always did, quietly, efficiently, without mercy. But eventually he would wonder. He would ask questions. Why had Thomas Delaney kept this map? Why had he hidden it? What had he intended to do with it? And eventually, Vincent Caruso would realize that Thomas Delaney had not been the loyal consigliere everyone believed. Thomas had been planning something, an insurance policy, a way out, a weapon to use if the Don ever turned on him. And when Vincent Caruso realized that, he would remember the widow on the hill, the woman who had given up the map so easily, the woman who claimed to know nothing. He would wonder if she had known more than she let on. He would wonder if she had kept copies. He would wonder if she was a threat. And then he would send someone to make sure she was not. Margaret stared at the ceiling. She was 72 years old. She had buried a husband, raised chickens, grown vegetables, and lived quietly for most of her life. She was not a killer. She was not a schemer. She was not brave. But she was a survivor, and survivors did what they had to do. The next morning, Margaret woke before dawn. She dressed warmly and walked down to the barn. Inside, beneath a tarp covered in hay and bird droppings, was Thomas's truck. It had not been driven in 3 years. The tires were flat. The battery was dead. But Margaret had kept it, just as she had kept the chest, just as she had kept the locked door to the basement. She pulled the tarp aside and opened the driver's side door. The interior smelled of old leather and tobacco. On the floor beneath the seat was a metal box. Margaret pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a pistol, a .38 revolver. Thomas had kept it for protection, he said. For coyotes and thieves. Margaret had never touched it. Until now. She lifted the gun. It was heavier than she expected, cold, unforgiving. She checked the cylinder. 6 bullets. She closed the cylinder and placed the gun in her coat pocket. Then she walked back to the house, made herself breakfast, and waited, because she knew they would come again. Not Angelo this time. Angelo had done his job. He had retrieved the map. He had reported back to the Don. His work was finished, but someone else would come. Someone whose job was not to retrieve. Someone whose job was to erase. Margaret poured herself another cup of coffee and sat by the window. The sun was rising. The frost was back, glittering on the fields like broken glass. And somewhere in the distance, on a road she could not see, a car was coming. She could feel it. She touched the gun in her pocket. She thought of Thomas, buried on the hill. She thought of the life they had built, the lies he had told, the secrets he had kept. She thought of the map in her dresser drawer, the real map, the one that could destroy a Don, and she thought of the choice she had made, to fight, to survive, to become something other than a quiet widow. Margaret Delaney finished her coffee. She set the cup in the sink. She checked the bullets one more time. And she waited for the knock on the door. The knock came on the 4th night, long after midnight. Margaret was awake, sitting in the armchair by the window with a blanket across her lap and the revolver in her hand. She had not slept properly in days. Every sound was a threat. Every shadow was a visitor. But when the knock finally came, soft and deliberate, 3 taps against the wooden door, she felt strangely calm. She rose from the chair and walked to the door. She did not turn on any lights. The house remained dark, except for the faint glow of the moon through the curtains. She stood with her back against the wall beside the door and spoke quietly. "Who is it?" A voice answered from the other side, low and smooth. "My name is Frankie Lombardo, ma'am. I work for Mr. Caruso. I need to speak with you. It is important." Margaret tightened her grip on the revolver. "What do you want?" "Just to talk, ma'am. 5 minutes. Then I will leave. You have my word." Margaret did not move. The word of a killer meant nothing, but if she did not open the door, he would find another way in. Men like Frankie Lombardo did not take no for an answer. She slid the revolver into her apron pocket, keeping her hand on the grip. Then she unlocked the door and opened it just wide enough to see the man standing on her porch. He was younger than she expected, maybe 40, with dark hair slicked back and a thin scar running along his jawline. He wore a long black coat and leather gloves. His eyes were the color of steel, cold and assessing. He did not smile. He simply nodded. "Thank you, ma'am. May I come in?" Margaret stepped aside. Frankie entered, his movements economical and precise. He glanced around the room, taking in the furniture, the windows, the doors. Then he turned to face her. Margaret closed the door, but did not lock it. She kept her hand in her pocket. "What do you want?" she asked again. Frankie removed his gloves slowly, one finger at a time. "Mr. Caruso wanted me to thank you personally for returning the map. It was very important to him, very valuable." Margaret said nothing. Frankie continued. "He also wanted me to make sure you understand something. The map you gave to Angelo contained sensitive information, information that could hurt people, important people. Mr. Caruso needs to know that you did not make copies, that you did not share what you found with anyone else. Do you understand?" Margaret met his gaze. "I do not understand maps. I told Angelo that. I gave him what I found because I wanted to be left alone. Frankie studied her face. His expression did not change. I believe you, ma'am, but Mr. Caruso is a careful man. He does not like loose ends, so I need to ask you some questions, just to be certain. He took a step closer. Margaret did not move. Her hand tightened on the revolver. Did you look at the map before you gave it to Angelo? Yes, Margaret said. I looked at it. I saw names and streets. I did not recognize any of them. Did you show it to anyone else? A neighbor? A friend? Family? No, I have no family, and I do not talk to my neighbors. Frankie nodded. Did you take any photographs? Make any notes? No. He took another step closer. He was less than 3 feet away now. Margaret could smell his cologne, sharp and chemical. Are you telling me the truth, ma'am? Margaret looked him in the eye. Yes. Frankie held her gaze for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had heard every lie, seen every betrayal, and learned to recognize truth only when it stared back at him without fear. I believe you, he said again, but Mr. Caruso wanted me to make absolutely certain. So I am going to look around your house, just to be thorough. You do not mind, do you? It was not a question. Margaret stepped aside. Do what you must. Frankie moved through the house like a ghost. He opened drawers and closets. He looked under furniture. He checked behind picture frames and inside cabinets. He was methodical, efficient, and utterly silent. Margaret followed him from room to room, her hand never leaving the revolver. When he reached the bedroom, he paused at the dresser. He opened each drawer slowly, lifting out clothing, feeling beneath the layers. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest. The map was in the top drawer, beneath the flannel, beneath the nightgowns. If he found it, she was dead. If he saw Vincent Caruso's name, if he understood what it meant, he would kill her right there in her bedroom and burn the house to the ground. Frankie lifted the nightgowns. His hand moved beneath them, feeling for anything hidden. Margaret's fingers closed around the grip of the revolver. She could feel the trigger beneath her finger. One pull, one shot. She had never killed anyone. She did not know if she could. But she would find out in the next 5 seconds. Frankie's hand paused. Margaret held her breath. Then he withdrew his hand, empty, and closed the drawer. He turned to face her. Nothing here, he said. Margaret exhaled slowly. She did not release the gun. Frankie walked past her and back into the living room. He stood by the door and pulled on his gloves. You are a smart woman, ma'am. Smarter than most people give you credit for. That is good. Smart people live longer. He opened the door. The cold night air rushed in. He stepped onto the porch, then turned back. One more thing, ma'am. If you do happen to remember anything, if you find anything else among your husband's belongings, you call the number on the card Angelo gave you. Do not wait. Do not hesitate. Because if Mr. Caruso finds out you held something back, I will be the one who comes back, and next time we will not just talk. Do you understand? Margaret nodded. Frankie tipped his head. Good night, ma'am. Sleep well. He walked to his car, a dark sedan parked at the edge of the driveway. The engine started, the headlights cut through the darkness, and then he was gone. Margaret closed the door and locked it. She walked to the bedroom and opened the top drawer. The map was still there, untouched. Frankie's hand had passed within inches of it, but he had not felt it. Or perhaps he had, and he had chosen not to look further. Perhaps he truly believed she was just a harmless old widow, or perhaps he was waiting to see what she would do next. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up to her. She had been seconds away from killing a man, seconds away from crossing a line she could never uncross. And the worst part was, she knew she would have done it, without hesitation, without remorse, because survival changed people. It stripped away everything soft and left only the hard core beneath, and Margaret's core was harder than anyone had ever suspected. She refolded the map and placed it back in the drawer. Then she lay down on the bed, fully clothed, the revolver beside her. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Thomas, about the life he had lived before he became a farmer, about the secrets he had kept, about the man he had been when he worked for Vincent Caruso. Thomas had been a consigliere, a counselor, a keeper of secrets. He had advised the Don, mediated disputes, and ensured that the family's business ran smoothly. But somewhere along the way, Thomas had started keeping secrets from the Don as well. He had compiled names, documented betrayals, mapped out the family's weaknesses. Why? As insurance? As leverage or as a way out? Margaret would never know. Thomas had taken those answers to his grave. But she knew one thing. Thomas had been afraid. Afraid enough to create the map. Afraid enough to hide it. Afraid enough to bury his past and disappear into the countryside with a woman who asked no questions. And if Thomas, who had been the Don's most trusted advisor, had been afraid of Vincent Caruso, then Margaret should be terrified. But she was not anymore. Fear had burned away over the past few days, replaced by something colder, something more dangerous. She had given the Mafia a fake map. She had lied to their faces. She had hidden evidence that could destroy their Don, and she had survived for now. But Margaret knew the game was far from over. Vincent Caruso would study the map. He would act on the information. And when the bodies started appearing, when the traitors started disappearing, when the family's enemies began to fall, the Don would feel secure again, untouchable, invisible. And that was when Margaret would make her move, because she had something Vincent Caruso did not know existed. Proof that the most powerful man on the eastern seaboard had once sold information to the federal government. Proof that the Don himself was a traitor. And in the world of organized crime, there was no greater sin than betrayal. Margaret rose from the bed and walked to the window. The moon was high and full, casting silver light across the fields. Somewhere out there, in the city, in the mansions and the clubhouses and the backroom offices, Vincent Caruso sat in his empire, believing himself safe, believing the map had been recovered, believing the widow was just a widow. But Margaret Delaney was not just a widow, not anymore. She was a woman with a weapon, a woman with a secret, a woman with nothing left to lose, and she was going to bring down a Don. The next morning, Margaret drove into town for the first time in weeks. She went to the library, a small brick building on Main Street that smelled of old paper and floor wax. The librarian, a young woman named Sarah, looked up in surprise when Margaret entered. "Mrs. Delaney," she said, "it has been ages. How are you?" Margaret smiled politely. "I am well, dear. I need to use the computer if that is all right." Sarah led her to one of the public terminals and helped her log in. Margaret had never been comfortable with computers, but Thomas had shown her the basics years ago. She knew how to search, how to find information, how to send messages. She waited until Sarah returned to her desk. Then she opened a web browser and typed carefully, "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Tips. Anonymous." The website loaded. Margaret read through the instructions. Then she opened a new email account using a fake name and a temporary address. She composed a message, choosing each word with care. "I have information regarding Vincent Caruso, head of the Caruso crime family. I have evidence that he worked as a federal informant in the past. I have documentation. I am willing to provide it in exchange for protection." She did not sign the email. She did not include her name or her address. She simply clicked send and watched the message disappear into the void. Then she cleared the browser history, logged out, and thanked Sarah on her way out. The drive back to the farm was quiet. Margaret felt strangely light, as if she had set down a burden she had been carrying for years. She had made her choice. She had taken the first step. There was no going back now. When she arrived home, she made herself lunch and sat at the kitchen table. She thought about what would happen next. The FBI would receive her message. They would investigate. They would try to trace the email, but they would find nothing. Eventually, they would realize the tip was legitimate, and they would want the evidence. And when they came looking for it, Margaret would be ready. She finished her lunch and washed her plate. Then she walked to the barn and started the old truck. The engine coughed and sputtered, but it turned over. Margaret smiled. She had work to do, preparations to make. A storm was coming, and she intended to be ready when it arrived, because Vincent Caruso had made a mistake. He had underestimated the quiet widow on the hill. He had assumed she was harmless. He had assumed she would disappear into obscurity, grateful to be left alone. But Margaret Delaney had spent 40 years being underestimated, and she was done being invisible. The Don was about to learn that some widows do not weep. Some widows sharpen their knives and wait for the perfect moment to strike. The response came faster than Margaret expected. 6 days after she sent the anonymous email, a man appeared at her door. He did not arrive in a black Cadillac. He did not wear an expensive suit. He drove a plain grey sedan and wore khaki pants and a windbreaker. He knocked 3 times just like the others, but his knock was different, official, purposeful, the knock of someone who did not need to threaten because the law was threat enough. Margaret opened the door. The man held up a badge. Special Agent Robert Chen, Federal Bureau of Investigation. May I come in, Mrs. Delaney? Margaret looked at the badge, then at his face. He was in his 40s, with tired eyes and the posture of a man who had spent too many years chasing shadows. She stepped aside. Agent Chen entered and glanced around the room with the same assessing gaze that Frankie Lombardo had used, but without the predatory edge. He was looking for threats, not opportunities. "Would you like coffee?" Margaret asked. "No, thank you, ma'am. I will not take much of your time." He sat on the sofa without being invited. Margaret sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. The revolver was upstairs in the nightstand. She had not expected to need it today. Agent Chen leaned forward. "Mrs. Delaney, I am here because we received an anonymous communication regarding your late husband, Thomas Delaney, and his connection to Vincent Caruso. The message suggested that you might have information relevant to an ongoing federal investigation." Margaret kept her face blank. "I do not know what you are talking about." Agent Chen studied her. "Ma'am, if you sent that email, you are not in any trouble. But if you have evidence, if you have documents or testimony that could help us build a case against Caruso, we need to know. This is not a man you want to play games with. If he even suspects you have something, you are in danger." Margaret met his gaze. "Why would I be in danger? I am just a widow. I live alone. I bother no one." Agent Chen sighed. "Ma'am, we know Thomas Delaney worked for the Caruso family. We know he was Vincent Caruso's Consigliere for nearly 15 years. We have been trying to build a RICO case against Caruso for the better part of a decade, but he is careful, very careful. If your husband kept records, if he documented anything, it could be the break we need." Margaret said nothing. Agent Chen continued. 2 weeks ago, we intercepted chatter suggesting that Caruso sent men to your property. We believe they were looking for something your husband had, a map, possibly, or documents. Did they find what they were looking for?" Margaret's expression did not change. "Some men came asking questions. I told them I knew nothing about my husband's past. They searched the house and left. That is all." Agent Chen leaned back. "So you are saying you do not have any information?" "I'm saying I do not know what you're talking about." The two of them sat in silence for a long moment. Agent Chen rubbed his face with both hands. "Ma'am, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I can tell when someone is hiding something, and I can tell when someone is in over their head. You are both. If you have evidence and you are holding on to it, thinking you can use it as leverage or protection, you are making a mistake. Vincent Caruso does not negotiate. He eliminates problems. And right now, you are a problem. Margaret stood. Agent Chen, I appreciate your concern, but I have nothing to give you. I think you should leave. Agent Chen rose slowly. He reached into his pocket and produced a business card. If you change your mind, call me. Day or night, we can protect you, but only if you let us. He placed the card on the coffee table and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. One more thing, ma'am. If Caruso sent men here once, he will send them again. And next time, they will not be polite. Think about that. He left. Margaret watched through the window as he got into his sedan and drove away. She picked up the business card and turned it over in her hands. Then she walked to the kitchen and placed it in the drawer beside Angelo's card, and the card Frankie had left on his first visit. 3 cards, 3 different worlds, all of them circling her like vultures. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at the table. Agent Chen was right. She was in over her head. She had set forces in motion that she could not control. The FBI was watching her. The Caruso family was watching her. And somewhere in between, Vincent Caruso himself was making calculations, deciding whether the widow on the hill was worth worrying about. Margaret had always known this moment would come, the moment when she had to decide whether to give up the map or use it, whether to trust the law or take justice into her own hands, whether to be a victim or a player. She finished her tea and walked upstairs to the bedroom. She opened the dresser drawer and took out the map. She spread it on the bed and stared at the names, the notations, the careful handwriting of a man who had once held the secrets of a criminal empire in his hands. Vincent Caruso, informant, federal. If she gave this map to Agent Chen, the FBI would investigate. They would dig into Caruso's past. They would find witnesses, documents, recordings. They would build a case, and eventually, Vincent Caruso would be arrested, tried, and sent to prison. Justice would be served. But Margaret knew it would not be that simple. The moment the FBI started investigating, Caruso would know someone had talked. He would know someone had given them information, and he would trace it back to her. Even if the FBI protected her, even if they put her in witness protection and gave her a new name in a new town, she would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, waiting for the knock on the door, waiting for the bullet. There was another option. She could destroy the map, burn it, bury it, forget it ever existed. She could go back to being the quiet widow, tending her garden, raising her chickens, living out her days in peace. The FBI would eventually give up. The Caruso family would forget about her, and she would be safe. But the idea of destroying the map made her stomach turn. Thomas had risked everything to create it. He had documented the truth, no matter how dangerous. He had kept it hidden for years, waiting for the right moment to use it. And now that moment had come. Not for Thomas, for her. Margaret refolded the map and placed it back in the drawer. Then she walked downstairs and picked up the phone. She dialed the number on Agent Chen's card. He answered on the second ring. Agent Chen, this is Margaret Delaney. I need to speak with you. In person, not at my house. There was a pause. When can you meet? Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, the library in town. Do you know it? I will find it. Margaret hung up. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was calm. She had made her choice. She would give the map to the FBI. She would testify if necessary. She would do whatever it took to bring Vincent Caruso down. Not for justice, not for revenge, but because Thomas had left her the weapon, and she would be damned if she died without using it. The next morning, Margaret dressed carefully. She wore her best coat and her sturdy shoes. She placed the map in a large envelope and tucked it into her purse. Then she drove into town. The library was nearly empty when she arrived. Sarah waved from behind the desk. Margaret waved back and walked to the reading room in the back. Agent Chen was already there, sitting at a table with a newspaper in front of him. He looked up when she entered and folded the paper. "Mrs. Delaney, thank you for coming." Margaret sat across from him. She placed the envelope on the table between them. "This is what you are looking for." Agent Chen opened the envelope carefully. He removed the map and unfolded it. His eyes moved over the paper, scanning the names, the locations, the notations. When he reached the top, when he saw Vincent Caruso's name and the words beneath it, his expression changed. He looked up at Margaret. "Is this real?" "Yes. Where did you get this?" "My husband made it, years ago. He kept it hidden. I found it after men from the Caruso family came looking for it." Agent Chen stared at the map. "This changes everything. If this is legitimate, if we can verify it, we can bring Caruso down. Do you understand what this means?" Margaret nodded. "It means he will come after me." Agent Chen refolded the map and placed it back in the envelope. "We can protect you. Witness protection, new identity, new life. You would have to leave the farm, leave everything behind, but you would be safe." Margaret shook her head. "I am not leaving my home. I have lived there for 40 years. I will die there if I have to. But I am not running." Agent Chen leaned forward. "Mrs. Delaney, you need to understand something. The moment we start using this evidence, Caruso will know. He has people everywhere, lawyers, judges, cops. He will find out that you gave us this map, and he will send someone to kill you. Not to scare you, not to threaten you, to kill you. Do you understand?" Margaret met his gaze. "I understand perfectly, but I am not running. You do your job, I will do mine." Agent Chen studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right. But I am assigning agents to watch your property. 24 hours. If anyone comes near your house, we will know." Margaret stood. "Do what you think is best, Agent Chen, but do it quietly. I do not want the neighbors asking questions." She left the library and drove home. The fields were brown and bare, the trees skeletal against the grey sky. Winter was coming. Margaret could feel it in the air, in the ache in her bones. She parked the truck and walked into the house. Everything was as she had left it, quiet, still, waiting. But she knew the quiet would not last. She had given the FBI the evidence they needed. The wheels were turning now. Investigations would begin, warrants would be issued, and Vincent Caruso would start looking for the person who had betrayed him. Margaret walked upstairs and retrieved the revolver from the nightstand. She checked the cylinder. 6 bullets. She placed the gun in her apron pocket and went downstairs to make supper. She cooked slowly, methodically, the way she had done for decades. But her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the days ahead, the confrontation that was coming, the moment when Vincent Caruso would finally understand that the quiet widow on the hill was not what she seemed. And she was thinking about Thomas, about the man he had been, the choices he had made, the secrets he had kept. He had lived in fear for years, always looking over his shoulder, always waiting for the dawn to discover the truth. And when he finally escaped, when he buried his past and became a farmer, he had thought he was free. But no one was ever truly free. Not in that world. Not when you knew the things Thomas knew. Margaret finished her supper and washed the dishes. Then she sat in the armchair by the window and watched the road. The sun set. The stars came out. And somewhere in the darkness, she knew, men were making plans. Decisions were being made. Orders were being given. And soon, very soon, those men would come for her. But Margaret Delaney was ready. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life, even if she had not known it. She had learned to survive, to endure, to wait for the right moment, and now the moment had arrived. She touched the revolver in her pocket. She thought of Thomas. She thought of the map. She thought of Vincent Caruso, the untouchable Don, the man who believed himself invincible. And she smiled. Because the Don was about to learn a lesson that Thomas had learned too late. In the end, everyone answers to someone, and sometimes that someone is just a quiet widow with nothing left to lose. Vincent Caruso came to the farm himself. Margaret had expected soldiers, enforcers, men with guns and cold eyes. She had expected Frankie Lombardo or Angelo Benedetti. She had not expected the Don. But on a cold November morning, 3 weeks after she gave the map to Agent Chen, a black Mercedes pulled into her driveway. Margaret was in the kitchen washing breakfast dishes when she saw it. She dried her hands on her apron and reached for the revolver in her pocket. Then she walked to the window and watched. The driver stepped out first. He was young and muscular, wearing a suit that barely contained his shoulders. He opened the rear door, and Vincent Caruso emerged. Margaret had never seen him in person, only in newspaper photographs from years ago. He was older now, maybe 70, with silver hair swept back from a lined face. He wore a long wool coat and walked with a cane, but there was nothing frail about him. He moved with the certainty of a man who had never been told no. Behind him, 2 more men exited the car. One was Angelo Benedetti. The other was someone Margaret did not recognize, a thin man with hollow cheeks and watchful eyes. They flanked the Don as he walked slowly up the path to the porch. Margaret opened the door before he could knock. "Mr. Caruso," she said, "I was wondering when you would come." Vincent Caruso stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He leaned on his cane and looked up at her. "Mrs. Delaney, may we come in? I would like to have a conversation." Margaret stepped aside. The 4 men entered her small house. The driver and the thin man remained standing near the door. Angelo took a position by the window. Vincent Caruso walked slowly to the sofa and sat down with a slight grimace. His age showed in the way he moved, in the careful placement of his cane, in the breath he took before speaking. Margaret sat in the armchair across from him. Her hand rested in her pocket, fingers wrapped around the revolver. Vincent Caruso noticed. He smiled faintly. "You will not need that, Mrs. Delaney. If I wanted you dead, you would already be dead. Then why are you here?" Vincent folded his hands over the head of his cane. "I am here because you have caused me a great deal of trouble. 3 weeks ago, the FBI began an investigation into my business dealings. They have issued subpoenas. They have interviewed associates. They have frozen accounts. And they are doing all of this because someone gave them information. Old information. Information that should have been buried with my former Consigliere." Margaret said nothing. Vincent continued, "I have spent considerable time and money tracing the source of this information, and every road leads back to you, Mrs. Delaney, to this farm, to the widow who claimed to know nothing about her husband's past." He paused. "You lied to Angelo. You lied to Frankie. You gave them a false map and kept the real one, and then you gave it to the FBI. That was very clever." Margaret met his gaze. "Thomas made that map for a reason. He wanted insurance. He wanted proof. And now the world will see what you really are." Vincent's expression did not change. "And what am I, Mrs. Delaney? A criminal, a killer, a man who built an empire on blood and fear." He leaned forward slightly. "I am all of those things, but I am also the man who kept this coast stable for 40 years. I settled disputes. I prevented wars. I made sure that business, legitimate and otherwise, ran smoothly. Your husband understood that. He served me faithfully for 15 years until he decided that his conscience was more important than his loyalty." Margaret's grip tightened on the revolver. "Thomas left because he knew what you were. He knew you were a traitor, an informant. He knew you sold out your own men to save yourself." Vincent's eyes hardened. "Your husband was a fool. He thought he understood the world, but he did not. He thought loyalty was absolute, that there were lines that should never be crossed. But the world does not work that way, Mrs. Delaney. Survival requires compromise. It requires making deals with devils. Thomas could never accept that. So he ran, he hid, and he spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. Margaret stood, her voice was steady. Thomas spent the rest of his life building something real, something good. He had peace. He had a home. He had me. That is more than you will ever have. Vincent rose slowly, using his cane for support. Perhaps, but I'm still here, and he is not. That is what matters in the end. Survival. He turned toward the door, then paused. I came here today to give you a choice, Mrs. Delaney. The FBI has evidence now, but evidence can be challenged. Witnesses can be discredited. I have the best lawyers money can buy. They will tear apart every document, every testimony, every piece of information you provided, and when they are finished, the case will collapse. But that takes time, and during that time you will live in fear. You will wonder when I will decide that you are more trouble than you are worth. You will wonder when someone like Frankie will knock on your door in the middle of the night. He looked at her. Or you can end this now. You can recant your statement. Tell the FBI you made a mistake, that the map was a forgery, that you were confused, that you wanted attention. They will be disappointed, but they will move on, and I will leave you alone. You can live out the rest of your days in peace. Margaret laughed. It was a short, bitter sound. You think I am afraid of you? You think I care whether I live or die? Mr. Caruso, I am 72 years old. I have buried a husband, lived through a lifetime of lies, and spent the last month preparing for this moment. I am not afraid, and I am not backing down. Vincent studied her. Then I am sorry, Mrs. Delaney. Truly. You are a remarkable woman. In another life you might have been useful to me, but in this life you are a threat, and I do not tolerate threats. He nodded to Angelo. Angelo reached inside his jacket. Margaret's hand moved. The revolver came out of her pocket, the barrel pointed directly at Vincent Caruso's chest. Every man in the room froze. Vincent raised an eyebrow. So you would shoot an old man in his own coat, in your own home? Margaret's hand did not waver. I would shoot a killer. A traitor, a man who destroyed lives and called it business. Yes, Mr. Caruso, I would shoot you. The room was silent. The thin man by the door had his hand inside his jacket. The driver had taken a step forward. Angelo's hand was still inside his coat, but none of them moved further, because they all knew that if Margaret pulled the trigger, the Don would die before any of them could stop her. Vincent Caruso smiled. It was a strange smile, almost admiring. You really would you not? He shook his head slowly. Thomas chose well. I never understood why he married a farm woman, why he gave up everything for a simple life. But I understand now. He saw something in you. Something dangerous, something strong. Margaret's finger rested on the trigger. Get out of my house. Vincent nodded. As you wish, but understand this, Mrs. Delaney. You have won the battle, but not the war. The FBI will investigate. They will uncover things, but I have survived worse. I have survived betrayals, arrests, assassinations. I will survive this. And when the dust settles, when the courts have spoken and the lawyers have finished, I will still be standing. He tapped his cane against the floor. Will you? He turned and walked slowly toward the door. Angelo followed. The driver opened the door. The thin man gave Margaret one last look, cold and measuring, then stepped outside. Vincent Caruso paused at the threshold. One more thing, he said, without turning around. Thomas used to tell me that the hardest part of this life was not the violence or the betrayal. It was the waiting, the knowledge that someday, somehow, everything you built would come crashing down. He lived with that knowledge every day, and now so will you. He stepped onto the porch and descended the steps. The four men returned to the Mercedes. The engine started. The car backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the road. Margaret lowered the revolver. Her hand was shaking now, the adrenaline finally breaking through. She sat down heavily in the armchair and placed the gun on the side table. Her heart hammered in her chest. She had pointed a gun at the most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard. She had threatened to kill him, and he had walked away. But she knew it was not over. Vincent Caruso did not make empty threats. He had given her a warning, a promise. The war had just begun. Outside, in the trees beyond her property line, 2 FBI agents watched through binoculars. They had seen the Mercedes arrive. They had seen the 4 men enter the house. They had radioed for backup, but by the time they received instructions, the men were leaving. The agents followed the Mercedes at a distance, documenting everything, but they did not intervene. Because Margaret Delaney had made it clear she did not want protection. She wanted justice, and justice, like revenge, required patience. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. The FBI investigation intensified. Agents interviewed dozens of witnesses. Forensic accountants traced financial records. The map that Margaret had provided became the foundation of a sprawling case that reached into every corner of the Caruso family's operations. Arrests were made, indictments were issued. Men who had worked for Vincent Caruso for decades suddenly found themselves facing federal charges. And through it all, Margaret remained on her farm. She tended her chickens, she repaired the fence, she prepared for winter. Agent Chen called her every few days with updates, but she listened without comment. She had done what she needed to do. The rest was out of her hands. Then, on a cold morning in late December, Agent Chen arrived at her door, unannounced. His face was grim. Margaret let him in and made coffee without asking what was wrong. She already knew. He sat at her kitchen table and wrapped his hands around the mug. "Vincent Caruso is dead," he said. Margaret sat down across from him. "How?" "Heart attack. Last night. He was at his home. His doctor says it was natural, that he had a bad heart for years." "But the timing is suspicious." Margaret nodded. She felt nothing, no satisfaction, no relief. Just a hollow emptiness where something should have been. "Did he know about the charges?" Agent Chen nodded. "He knew. We were preparing to arrest him next week. The grand jury had voted to indict. He was going to spend the rest of his life in prison." He looked at Margaret. "Some people are saying he could not live with the shame, that he chose to die on his own terms rather than face trial. Others think it was not a heart attack at all, that someone in his own family decided he was too much of a liability." Margaret sipped her coffee. "Does it matter?" Agent Chen was silent for a moment. "I suppose not. The case will continue. We will go after the rest of the family, but without Caruso, it will be harder. He was the center of everything. With him gone, the organization will fracture. Some men will cooperate to save themselves. Others will disappear." He looked at her. "You are safe now, Mrs. Delaney. Whatever happens, you are safe." Margaret set down her mug. "Am I?" Agent Chen did not answer. After he left, Margaret walked through her house. She touched the furniture, the walls, the things that had been part of her life for so long. Everything looked the same. But nothing felt the same. She had set out to bring down a Don, and she had succeeded. Vincent Caruso was dead. The Caruso family was collapsing. Justice, in its own twisted way, had been served. But she did not feel victorious. She felt tired, old, alone. She walked upstairs and opened the dresser drawer. The space where the map had been was empty now. She had given it away. She had used Thomas's final weapon, and now there was nothing left but memories. Margaret closed the drawer and walked to the window. The fields were covered in snow, white and pristine. The barn leaned a little further to the left. The trees were bare skeletons against the grey sky. Everything was as it had always been. But Margaret knew she had changed. She was no longer the quiet widow who asked no questions. She was a woman who had lied to killers, deceived the Mafia, and brought down a criminal empire. She was a woman who had pointed a gun at a Don and lived to tell about it. And she was a woman who would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, because Vincent Caruso was gone, but his family remained. And in that world, loyalty and revenge were two sides of the same coin. Margaret turned away from the window. She walked downstairs and made herself supper. She ate slowly, tasting nothing. Then she washed her dishes and put them away. She locked the doors and turned off the lights. She climbed into bed with the revolver on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the wind howled. Snow began to fall. And in the darkness, Margaret Delaney closed her eyes and thought about Thomas, about the life they had built, about the secrets they had kept, about the choices that had led them both to this moment. She had survived. She had won. But the cost of victory, she realized, was that she would never stop paying. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine started. Margaret opened her eyes and listened. The sound grew louder, then faded away. She waited. Minutes passed, then hours, but the car did not return. Margaret closed her eyes again, and this time, finally, she slept. When spring came, the farm woke up. The snow melted, the fields turned green, the chickens laid eggs, and Margaret Delaney, the widow who had brought down a Don, planted her garden and tended her land, and lived quietly, just as she always had. But every night, before she went to bed, she checked the revolver. She made sure the doors were locked. She listened for the sound of car engines on the gravel road, because she knew the truth that Thomas had known, that Vincent Caruso had known, that every person who lived in that shadowy world understood. The war never really ends. It just pauses. And in the silence between battles, the only thing you can do is wait. And Margaret Delaney had become very, very good at waiting.